At our class and carried on in the discussion over love, biblical love, and took us through what effectively is going to be our anchor text for the entire study. And when I say anchor text, what I mean by that is something that kind of keeps us grounded to the study over biblical love, even though we'll branch out and we'll talk about, look at and review and analyze different aspects of love and what love looks like, and hopefully walk away with some, actionable, thoughtful things that we could do to kind of plug into our own life, and really, as Christians, be more loving in a biblical manner and in a biblical way. We want to keep going back to 1 John, and again, Brother Hill did such an excellent job at continuing that dive into that particular text. So I just want to come back to it brief enough to just remind us of what 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 through 11 tells us, and then we'll expand outward to some additional text here this morning. So I'm going to start in 1 John chapter 4, verse 7, and it says this: "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. In this the love of God was manifested towards us, that God has sent His only begotten Son into the world that we might live through Him. In this is love, not that we loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another." And boy, that is so key. And in preparation for this, I actually wanted to go back, and this is one of the beauties of the technology of the day, a little bit scary and kind of intimidating. Since we were gone 2 weeks ago and Brother Hill stood in and facilitated class, I wanted to go back and listen to it, which you can on YouTube, which is kind of scary enough to know right now that all of my words, everything I say, the inflection in my voice, all of those things are being recorded and, in fact, I think broadcasted live right now to the internet. That's very scary. Now, again, it's not, I won't fool myself. I know there's not millions of people listening and probably won't be. However, it is a little bit intimidating. In fact, I looked yesterday, and Brother Hill, did you know that YouTube actually transcribes our words that we're speaking, and you can actually look at the script of what we're saying word by word? I don't know the magic of YouTube and how it does it, but you can actually go see. So, if I'm sitting here saying and oh and sound just befuddled in general, YouTube picks up all that stuff and puts it down there. Again, a little bit weighty. I'm feeling the weight on my shoulders, brother. Okay, well, I appreciate it. Thank you for the confidence. But as I was listening to it, one of the things that I was reminded of, as Frank took us through that study 2 weeks ago, was how actionable love really is intended to be. Again, in modern parlance in 2023, love is such a schmoofy, floofy, sort of emotional thing, and we use it, overuse it, and generalize the term, so much so that it really has become almost insignificant in many ways in the English language. But he reminded us and talked about how actionable, and as an example of that, he had talked a little bit about what it's like for, guys as they're going after or courting, we might say, a young lady, and how actionable that love really is. I mean, that's an actionable thing when you're a young man trying to catch a young lady's eye. And I had to ask him this morning, "Hey, brother, how many years have you been married?" And he said, "Hey, it goes all the way back to 1984. So, we had to use all of our fingers and toes to kind of do the math on that. He's closing in on 4 decades, really. So that's really an amazing thing. And man, at that point in time, a young man, when he's courting that woman, is willing to do anything, jump through any hoop to try to impress. You'll even light the hoop on fire. But love is actionable, and it really was made manifest, again, when you look at 1 John, really the message is there in chapter 4, verses 7 through 11, is that love is actionable, and it was made manifest through Christ, that He be sent on the cross to sacrifice Himself, and that's how much God loved us. It's really an amazing thing. So now what we're going to do today is we want to transition over to 1 Corinthians 13. And you, brethren, already know what's up and the importance of this particular chapter. And so what we'll do today is we'll look at love defined. And nearly 15 different characteristics or examples of what love is there in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. You know, it's such a poignant kind of poetic message about love when you go through 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that it might be the single most used set of scriptures for wedding ceremonies. I've had the opportunity to perform and facilitate one wedding ceremony. I had the chance to marry Jeanette's younger sister, my sister-in-law Annie, and her husband back in 2016. And I've only done one. And, you know, I figured, hey, you've got to use, isn't that something that's almost mandatory when you're performing a wedding ceremony? You've got to use 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It's so beautiful. It's so poetic when you think about it. You know, love is patient. Love is kind. It has this sort of beautiful way of just sort of rolling off of your tongue and out of your mind. It's quite beautiful. But the interesting thing is, when you look at everything else that's going on in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, it would to you that the church at Corinth there is a little bit of a mess. And it comes out in the manner in which Paul, as he's writing to the church at Corinth, it comes out when you read that letter. And there's a couple of things I think I could point to, and we'll look at these in just a second. In fact, if you want to start flipping over to the very first chapter, we can do that together. But I've never noticed before, and there's probably a study on this, but when you sort of go through 1 Corinthians 13, let your eyes kind of scan through chapter 1, through chapter 2, through chapter 3. You notice a lot of heavy punctuation. Have you ever thought about that? You ever looked at that? You ever seen a study on that? There's a lot of exclamation points in 1 Corinthians. There's a lot of question marks in 1 Corinthians. And those question marks are attached to what we would call rhetorical questions. And that's the sign of frustration. When you read through 1 Corinthians, you really see a lot of frustration from Paul, because here, the early church has just gotten off the ground. The church at Corinth specifically has had many opportunities to be buoyed and lifted up and have had examples and models of what Christianity should be and should look like. And in many ways, they were a mess. And that was frustrating. Let's take a look at chapter 1 in 1 Corinthians. And we'll start at verse 10. You know, of course, Paul begins the letter in a kind and gentle way, greeting them. But by the time we get to verse 10, we see this. Now I plead with you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and the same judgment. For it's been declared to me concerning you, my brethren, by those of Chloe's household, that there are contentions among you. Now I say this, that each of you says, I am Paul, or I am of Paul, or I am of Apollos, or I am of Cephas, or I am of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? There's one of those rhetorical questions. Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius. Why? Because people at that time, members of the church at that time, were really factioning themselves off, not only by the spiritual gifts that they had, which we'll see here in just a little bit, and saying, well, you know, I have the ability to speak in tongues, or I have the ability of healing, or look at these things that I've done. I've given all of my things to the poor. You know, they were factioning themselves off, ranking themselves. Some people were saying, well, you know, I am of Christ. Some people were saying, my lineage, my Christian lineage, my religious lineage is of Paul. My religious lineage is of Peter. And we're not talking hundreds or thousands of years after the establishment of the church. We're just talking about the first century. Are y'all with me? Divisions in the church. This was a very frustrating thing, and you can see that meted out through the scripture here. Let me show you another example of what I mean. Let's go to chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 14, Paul writes this, I don't write these things to shame you, but as my beloved children, I warn you, for though you might have 10,000 instructors in Christ, yet you do not have many fathers. For in Christ Jesus I have begotten you through the gospel. Therefore I urge you, imitate me. There's a lot there. Paul says, you've had the instruction of Jesus, you've got the model of Jesus, and that's worth 10,000. It's an interesting number, right? That's worth 10,000 separate instructors. But you've not had many fathers. Well, let me ask you this. What does a father do? That was not a rhetorical question. You can answer that. What does a father do?
Guide and protect.
Sir?
Guide and protect this kid.
A father guides. A father protects. A father nurtures. Say, a father leads. A father admonishes. That's a really fancy term for correction, right? A father corrects. A father gets you back on the right track. And he says, you've had lots of instruction, but you've not had lots of fathers. Something else I think that's interesting and worth probably pointing out here, just as an aside, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the love concept, but what does Paul tell them in that third or so verse? I'm sorry, it's really the 16th verse there in the chapter. What does he tell them to do? Imitate me. Imitate me. Follow me. That's a pretty amazing statement. I mean, this is Paul here, of course. But it really, it kind of gives me an opportunity to reflect, I think, on my own life and on the model that I might be for other people. Sometimes we don't realize that we are influential to people and that we are to be a model and separated and something different. And I wonder if you and I could say to a new Christian, to somebody who's newly baptized, could we say, hey, imitate me, follow me. If you don't know what to do, look at me, watch my model. That's powerful. But this is what he's saying. Lots of instruction, but few fathers, little guidance, little correction. Something else that we have to take into account here, we can't get too finger pointing to the first century church because what they're doing is something completely different. This is very new, what they're being asked to do. You know, it's not like today. For people like myself, for people like you, we've got thousands of years of history through the church that we can look back at. We've got the convenience and the ease and the instruction of having the Bible sort of easily bound and made beautiful, and yours is probably bound in some kind of wonderful leather, and it might even have a little gold leaf stamp with your name on it, and there's a great index back there. In fact, you know, when I look at my Bible, you know, most of my Bible is actually not biblical text. There's a lot of indexes and maps, and if I don't know what Corinth looks like, there's a map in here that'll show me exactly what Corinth looks like and how far it might have been away from the city of Samaria. And if I wanted to know about Paul, I could go to index section 2334, and it'll give me all the information I need to know about Paul and concordant verses, where I can go look and gather information and cite text. And, you know, if that's too much work, then I could just go to the Bible app and have it do it all for me, or just Google, tell me about Paul. But it's not like that in the first century, so they're just trying to figure this out. And there's some changes culturally, and this This is important, and this brings us back to this study on love. There's some changes to the way that they view and sort of their philosophy on life. Let's take a look at Mark chapter 12. Go to Mark 12 with me. Mark 12, we're going to go to 28. Then one of the scribes came, and having heard them reasoning together, perceiving that he had answered them well, asked him, that is to say Jesus, which is the first commandment of all? Jesus answered him, the first of all commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment. And the second, like it, is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. What Jesus is introducing there to this group is that concept of agape love. Loving because you've been loved. Loving someone not because they deserve the love, but because love has been shown to you, because love and grace have been shown to you, and therefore we reciprocate that model that God showed us through His Son Jesus Christ, and we give that back, we reflect that back to the world through our actions and our behavior and what we do. Are y'all with me? But really the world, the first century, was not like that at the time. This concept of agape love was a very unique thing. When you think about the world even nowadays, I think there's probably, this is a Googleable thing, I'm sure, but there's somewhere near 8 billion people in the world. Does that sound right? 8 billion? Something like that, give or take. Even in 2023, church, the world is a rough place. Most places in the world, most of the 8 billion people, even today in 2023, live extraordinarily difficult lives and live, in many cases, under extreme repression and are living hand to mouth and don't necessarily know where the next meal is coming from. It's so far from where my life and your life is today that we can't even conceive of it. Imagine what it must have been like 2,000 years ago. And really the best way that we can conceive of it maybe is through readings and through books and through movies and that kind of thing, art. But life 2,000 years ago was vicious. It was tough. It was brutal. People were not good to one another. This concept of kindness and being polite and being easygoing and, oops, excuse me, we've kind of bumped into each other as we get off the elevator, that was not life. I think sometimes I take that for granted, that I'm not constantly on the defense, having to defend myself and my family from people who want to kill me and take what I have. But life is pretty good. And it's pretty good because we treat one another pretty well, for the most part. There's quite a bit of decorum that goes on, especially with the people that we keep in our constellation. You're a good person, and you probably hang out with pretty good people. But life was not always like that. And so this concept of agape love that the church was expected to exercise and display towards one another, very different. And so really what we see and what Paul is addressing in Corinth is that, what I'm going to call human nature. When left to their own devices, or let me say it like this, when we're not careful, sometimes we like to try to scale things. Sometimes we like to try to rank ourselves. Sometimes we try to we try to build ourselves up by tearing other people down. That's the human condition at times, if we are not careful. How do I know that? Because I can read it about the first century church, who was just a stone's throw away from the crucifixion. Are y'all with me? They were so close to the actual construction of the first century church, but yet still that human part of them creeped in. Love your neighbor as yourself. And we'll do a lesson on that coming up, but this is a new concept. Any thoughts on that? I've been talking for a little bit. Yes, ma'am.
Love your neighbor as yourself means, part of it, that you need to understand what your neighbor is going through. So even though we're Christians and we're here together and, it's nice, for some people who are Christians, their life is not like your life. And it's kind of disconcerting that if you want to talk about that, then the response is, well, that's political. No, that's part of my life. So if my sons are driving down the road on the highway, it is more likely that they will get stopped and they will be injured by a policeman. That's not political. That's a part of my life. So as Christians, we need to accept the fact and understand that just because you're a Christian, everybody's life, even here in the United States, is not the same.
You know, Miss Brown and I know each other very well.
Yeah, we do.
We go back.
Way back.
Way back. Y'all don't even know this. I was baptized when I was 17 years old. I had just turned 17. Never heard of Lakeside Church of Christ until I was 16 years old. 5 years before that, though, and this is maybe just the providence of God. 5 years before that, my family and I moved into a neighborhood, Quails Holler. It's right off of 220 in Henley. And just down the road, I met two young boys, twins. The Browns' children. And I can remember, a little anecdote here, I can remember it probably was Tim who invited me in. Hey, come on in the house. And all of a sudden, we're just traipsing around the house, and Miss Brown is, I think, maybe taking a nap or had fallen asleep on the couch. I don't mean to tell on you, but everybody takes a nap. It's okay. And I think I'm pouring some, dinosaur Kool-Aid or something like that, or they probably didn't have Kool-Aid. We were probably drinking water. I don't know what it is. They're a little health conscious. And she wakes up, and she sees this kid she's never known or seen before sitting there making himself at home in the house. But you know what was interesting is I had the opportunity 5 years before we ran into each other again here at the church to meet someone and know somebody who was a Christian and who didn't holler and scream or have a crazy reaction, because that's not her way. She showed me loving kindness. She showed me grace. She welcomed me into her home even though she was startled. And here's why I say all that. I say all that because I think it comes in stark contrast to something that I must confess to you this morning. When she said what she said, I could feel myself becoming political. I could feel myself bristling up just a little bit, because we all have our own biases, right? And we love each other. But we all have our own biases. And I could feel myself bristling up and getting a little bit political, and I could feel that, even though she was telling me that sometimes as Christians, that's what we do, and that's how we treat each other. And we know each other. We love each other. Christian brothers and sisters. She has done much for me to look out for me. And my immediate reaction still, and I had to correct myself, I had to rein myself back in, and that's why I confessed that to you this morning. I had to rein myself in for a minute and say, Justin, put yourself in her position. Put yourself in her shoes. Don't immediately react. Don't immediately jump the gun. Because love is the ability to put ourselves in the positions of other people and to listen to them and consider their thoughts and feelings and put them above our own. And even today, even with the history that we have and the depth of the agape love that she has shown me over the course of my life, since before I was an adult, I still bristled a bit. And if that would happen to me, imagine the first century church. That's what I'm getting at. Are y'all with me? I appreciate you saying that. It is hard. Yes, sir. Could we, and I'm not doing a good job of facilitating the microphone. We got a mic coming to you so that we can hear. All the people on YouTube need to be able to hear you, okay?
So if they'll put their hand up high so we can see you.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I've done a little research, and I don't believe, you might correct me on this, but I don't believe the word agape is used in the Old Testament. I don't believe that's the kind of love that you see in the Old Testament. You may know more about it than I, but the research I've seen doesn't refer to agape. It refers to one of the other types of love.
There's probably a very strong likelihood. One of the things I do know, I don't know to answer that question. I would take your word on that. Again, that's probably a Googleable thing. I do know in the research and preparation, we do have a hand up here. I do know in the research and preparation for class, the term agape, when you go back even in the contemporary writings of the day, so if you go back and you look at the philosophers of the day in Greek and in Rome, that would have been contemporary to the writing of this, even hundreds of years before. So during even the intermediate time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, that agape concept is not something that you see written or talked about or discussed. In fact, really the concept of the day from the very best Greek philosophers, when you start looking at Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the concept was not to show agape love or love for love's sake or love because I've been loved, that sacrificial love. Really, the concept of the day was to value people based off what they could do for you. And if you thought it was stupid, then they were stupid. And you go to battle and you be combative. That was really the concept of the day. And as you guys know, Brother Hill actually talked about it a couple weeks ago, but I'll go back to reference it again. You go back and the Greeks had many different words. I'm not sure what I can trust on the internet and what I can't, but I found at least 7 or 8 different words that were used for love at the time. And there was the type of love between a father and a son, and of course the type of love that you would have between young people who were dating, and the type of love that you would have between a husband and wife, and the type of love that you would have between, these different coworkers or that type of thing. But this agape love, this untethered love, this love for love's sake, very new concept. So it's not a wonder that they would have trouble with it. Yes, sir.
You're talking about love. Something that I have realized. We don't have to be best friends per se, but we need to be kind to each other. Because I think that's the way we should live. That shows God's light.
You bring up a very good point, and that's something that Paul is actually going to tell us in the following passages there in 1 Corinthians 13, that there is a certain decorum in a relationship that has to exist, and a certain kindness that has to exist between Christians specifically. And so although, again, as I mentioned, even performing a wedding ceremony, many times you'll hear this love is patient, love is kind passage. Really the intention, and although it fits there, really the intention as Paul is writing this is to discuss the relationship from Christian to Christian in the first century church. And of course, for us today. When you look at the verses and the passages preceding 1 Corinthians chapter 13, what was the big discussion in Corinthians 12? When you go back and you look at the 12th chapter there, What do we know 1 Corinthians 12 for? Spiritual gifts. Who said that? Spiritual gifts. That's where you get that discussion over the eye cannot, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, so forgive me if, but the eye cannot put itself above the foot needs the eye, and the hand needs the foot. And these are things that in combination together create the whole body. Yes.
Part of the reason for the division in the Corinthians church is, of course, the different ethnicities. The Jewish Christians were there, and they had just emerged from Judaism, and the Gentile Christians that were there had just emerged from idolatry. So, and there were rich and poor mixed together, but they were still able to, a large number of them anyway, we gather from the Corinthians, able to love each other in spite of the differences in their ethnicity and economics and everything else. They could see through that and they could still love each other.
Very good point. You know, when you think about, again, the history of who these people were, they're coming from very different backgrounds. For the converted Jews, they were coming from a system where they had 613 Levitical laws, and now we're saying really there are two that you need to focus on. Again, I'll go back to that passage in Mark. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And then, of course, as you mentioned, you've got the Gentiles that are coming from idolatry, from this sort of like, I don't know, what do they call it? The survival of the fittest almost mentality, and this combative and aggressive, in some cases, mentality. And your only value is based on what you can do for me. And that wasn't the nature here. But of course, in order to spread the gospel, Christians were provided different gifts. And you see that some had the ability to speak in tongues, and there were certain things that were more valued and prized than other things. Let's go to the beginning of chapter 13.
Justin, I just got a comment, food for thought.
Yes, sir.
You know, the Jewish community, they were not foreign to the concept of the command that God had already given them when he said, love your neighbor as thyself. See, they were already familiar with that, but putting it into practice and action, that's the problem that they had, putting it into action.
That reminds me that the Greeks actually even had a word for self-love, self-care. So it was a thing 2,000 years ago before we came up with that term on Instagram or what have you.
Got one comment here.
Yes.
Even in the Old Testament, love was, although the word agape is not in the Old Testament because it was written in Hebrew and Aramaic, but the concept of love is definitely there. We find even with slaves, they had rights. If they were hurt, they had protection. The eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was the law of the land for the Hebrew community. So there was love. It's just not that word, but it was expected and demanded by the law of Moses.
And I wouldn't disagree with what you're saying. I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. I think there is an evolution, for lack of a better term, from that kind of situational, transactional, maybe you would say, philosophy to something that is more expansive in how we should see the world and how we should treat people. But you're right. This has been modeled for us, love, all the way back to Genesis. You can see the love that God had for man. And so I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. Verse 1 in chapter 13, let's start there. Paul says this, though I speak with the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I have become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned but have not love, it profits me nothing. That's a powerful statement. These are gifts from God. The gift of prophecy, the gift of speaking in tongues, a desire to sacrifice one's wealth and one's resources to other people, to the poor. The willingness to sacrifice one's own body for the faith. These are big things. These are important things. But Paul says here, all of that's hollow if you don't have love. It's meaningless if you don't have love. That's a powerful statement. What I hear Paul saying, or when I read the text, what I get from Paul is that Paul's saying, you can utilize the gifts that you've been given from God. You can go out there and make extraordinary sacrifices, because that's what giving your life for Christ is. That's an extraordinary sacrifice. That ain't just showing up to church on Sunday and Wednesday. We're talking about people that in some instances were taking all that they had and giving to the poor. We're talking about people who in some instances were putting their life and the lives of their family at risk for the name of Christ and for the furtherment of the church. That's a big deal. But Paul says it's hollow, it's meaningless. It's like the clanging brass on the side of the trader's mule as he takes it to the market, because that's what we're not talking about the cymbal or the gong in some versions as it's referenced. We're not talking about a musical instrument. They're talking about the hollow sounds and the annoying sounds of the clanging lamps and the trader's tchotchkes as he goes to market. The execution of God's gifts, I'm going to say it another way. The execution of God's gifts are hollow if we do not do it from a place of love. And can I take that one step further? And we'll go to Mr. Kovar. I'm going to suggest this, and I don't think it's a far reach, but I want to make it mean something for me today. There are things that we must do as 21st century Christians in order to express my love to God. I should pray. I should attend worship. I should partake in the Lord's Supper. I should give of my resources. But if I do those things and I don't do it in a manner, with a manner of love, it's hollow. It's like the clanging cymbal or the sound of brass. It's meaningless. It's nothing. And so that's a real exhortment to me to check myself, just and reflect. Because sometimes, again, I've mentioned and I've confessed from up here before and from a class before, I really, really, really like things that I can quantify. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in here. I like a checkoff list. I like to be able to quantify things. And you know what? Put money in the collection plate is something I can check off. Attending worship is something I can quantify. If there are 4 Sundays in a month, which I think there are probably in February, right? Maybe. And I attend worship and I worship God on those 4 Sundays, I can quantify that. I can look back at the end of the year at the check ledger and identify how much I've given to the church. Some people even quantify the number of souls that they save or the amount of people that they baptize. That's okay. But if I do those things without love, all of that other stuff is void of meaning. Yes, sir.
I think another way of saying it is, I have to, or I want to. See, and some people think I have to go to church. See, and I think that's what he's getting at here. It's a whole difference. You should want to. I want to go to church. I want to participate in the worship service, not, well, man, I have to do the Lord's Supper today, or I have the Devo. And I think that's what he's getting at here. You can do all those things, but you got to have that love or that willingness, that want to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell, as we prepare to close out, I'm going to tell another Linda Brown story, if you're okay with that. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you're about 5 feet away from me. Back in 2015, we call it maybe the spring or the winter of 2015, Jeanette and I had gone and saw Linda Brown for nutrition advice. She's a nutrition expert. I don't know what the title is, but that is something that she does. And I had put on lots of weight, and I know you're looking at me and saying, well, you still got it on you, Justin, and you're right. You're right about that. But that's a relative thing, okay? I've been fatter than this, is what I'm trying to say. And I had put on a little extra holiday weight. It was February, I think, when we went and saw you. Pretty close to Valentine's Day, so I was trying to slim up for my wife, And we had gone to see Miss Brown. And we met with her for about an hour, and she talked with us about health and nutrition. Not stuff necessarily that I probably didn't know, but, we all kind of know generally the principles of what we should do and what we shouldn't do. I shouldn't eat at McDonald's 14 times a week. She told me not more than once a month, and that was pushing it. And I said, are you kidding me? What, am I being punked right now? That can't be right. So she gave me a list. I told you, I love to quantify. I love a checklist. She gave me a list. She said, okay, Justin, here's the amount of calories that you can eat if you want to lose weight in a day. And here's how you can get those calories. And you can get them from this big list. And you can put these things together in this way. And she sort of showed me how to do that. And again, I guess I should have known that, but I really didn't, And so it was on paper, and we took it home, and we put it on the refrigerator. And I looked at it, and here was the most important thing. I followed it. That's the toughest part, right? I followed it. And in 6 weeks, I lost 35 pounds. In 6 weeks, I couldn't keep weight on. Now, some of that weight that I lost, I have found again. But you know what? It's because I got away from the list. At some point in time, I took it down off the refrigerator. Probably because I felt like, hey, things are going well. I had to buy all new clothes. I kept losing the weight. And then I deviated from the list. I deviated from the plan. And the reason that I bring that up is because God, through Paul and his wisdom, gives us a bit of a checklist, if you will, for those of you that like to quantify things. And that's where we will go next week when we come together next time. We'll get into verses 4, 5, and 6, and we'll see the love is statements and the love is not statements. And we'll discuss what those things are and how we can apply those things to our life. And as I was reading those things, it brought me back yesterday as I was preparing for class to my list of foods that I could and could not eat. The plan. God gives us the plan. He gives us the recommendations. He gives us the things that we should do and the things that we shouldn't do through Paul. And those things are extraordinarily powerful, such that if we want to know what agape love should look like, I can go to that in the text and I can follow that. And we're going to unravel those things and we're going to peel back those layers next week. As we prepare to close out, when we do close, we'll ask Brother Kovar if he would lead us in a prayer, and we'll give Brother Ray the last word.
Basically, what 13's about is our attitudes. When you mentioned sacrifices, Cain and Abel sacrificed. But Cain's was not right because of his attitude, how he sacrificed. Oh, I got to give to God today. Where Abel's was, I want to give to God today. And the love they're asking for, God gave us Jesus when we didn't deserve it, nor did we earn it.
Yet he loved us enough to give him to us. Do we love him enough to give ourselves back to who gave us everything?
Well put. Steve, would you close us out in prayer?
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we're so grateful for another Lord's Day. We're so grateful for another class. We thank you for Justin. He so ably is able to talk about the scriptures and present them the way that we can understand. And Father, we all know about love, and Father, just it's good to reflect and to go back to what you have to say what love is. Father, help us to love one another with the love that Jesus